Okay, good morning, everyone. You are really lucky to have, or actually, you are quite smart to have welcome that early this morning, because this talk is one of the one I was the most looking for. Like one of them, like the stuff you get back from organizing a conference like that, besides having the community, like having the community coming together, is that you get to make come actually the people that you follow a lot online, like the people that you admire in your field. And Dan is one of those this morning that I follow a lot, and I'm really glad that he accepted to come with us. So please help me welcome him and put your hand together. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Is this on? I know that I can't actually hear anything, but you can hear me. Cool. So I can be loud if I need to be, so I don't necessarily need that, but I'll try not to be. How many of you stayed out later than you should have last night? Vitaly, I see you. I didn't. I was responsible. I've lodged a complaint with the organizers that no conference should ever have the after party on the first night, especially when I'm speaking early in the morning. I'm going to challenge you this morning. This is not going to be a list of tips or tricks or how-tos. This is going to be something that hopefully engages your brain and keeps you thinking for a while. It's very important to me that as our industry grows, and when I say industry, I know we're at the point now where it's kind of, if we're talking web design, we can say industry because it is kind of one umbrella, but we're starting to branch out into so many different directions because our skill sets are really broad. But even considering that, we're still interaction designers. Whether we're building for web or we're building for mobile devices or desktops, it doesn't really matter. We're doing the same kind of things, solving the same kind of problems, working with the same kinds of people. And as our industry continues to mature, because we're still a young industry, even though we feel, because of the speed that our industry moves, that we've been around a long time, let's face it, compared to any other industry, we're babies. We're still in diapers. We just move very, very quickly. Now, there are good things that come from moving very quickly, but looking forward to the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years of where this industry is going and what people who come into our industry down the road will experience and what they'll see as far as a mature industry, a mature workspace, is defined by the stuff that we do now. Now that is why things like web standards and best practices are so important to discuss, because we're setting foundations for what we do every day, but also what will happen in the future. But there's another aspect to what we do and how we act and how we speak that does the exact same thing, but they're not things that we necessarily apply in our project, but they're things like language, the language that we use between each other employees or coworkers or other organizations, and also with our clients. And as we write about things and speak about things and teach each other, these things set up a foundation for what comes next. Now, before I get into the specifics, I'm going to talk a little bit about language in general and why it's so important for us. Especially, I think, it's one thing if I were speaking to a completely native English-speaking audience, but I mean, you actually have a better understanding, I think, of the importance of language in communication. I feel very jealous as someone who grew up in the United States where people don't tend to learn other languages. That actually limits your worldview a lot. It limits your understanding. Unfortunately, as opposed to how many people in this room know at least 3 languages? Yeah, I hate all of you. It wires your brain in a different way, and you understand that communication and words are much more powerful and much more meaningful than someone who maybe just knows one language and takes a lot of things for granted. But when we use language as we do, where it's just kind of an automatic thing, we speak without thinking about it. Even if you grow up learning different languages, speech and writing and language ends up being second nature. If it wasn't, we would have a really hard time going through the day. So we have to remember some of the basics about language. Doesn't matter what language it is, but words themselves. Words have a lot of power, right? They can do all sorts of magnificent things. They can inspire, they can enrage, they can be used to praise and to congratulate. They can be used to offend or insult or inflict injury, right? They can be used to cause confusion. Even the absence of words implies all sorts of different meaning. When you read a phrase like this, you can insert all sorts of things, and the meaning is going to change completely. So removal of words has just as much power as the word itself. Sadness, joy, anger, elation, words can convey all sorts of emotions, all powerful stuff that we use language to do. Even the context of words in language makes a massive difference in their meaning, right? Basic colors like white and black, if you're used in a sentence like this, they're not just words anymore. The context gives them much deeper meaning of some sort, whatever the context happens to be. When we change that context, the words themselves kind of adapt. They're very powerful, but very adaptable. But if we don't use words carefully, then again, the context and the way we use them can have very different results. Very benign words like this that change context, in the right context, can have a whole lot of extra power and strength behind them. Right? Context matters a lot. Words, when used alone, can mean one thing. Paired with something else completely changes the meaning. I mean, this is one of the most amazing things about language. Not just the English language, it's just fantastic that with the web we happen to have this common language that allows us to all speak and work together around the world in an amazing way. We can become desensitized to them. My mom even doesn't blink at saying shit. Granted, I did learn all of my bad words from my mother. It's important to note, too, even though I grew up mostly in the U.S., my mom's English, so I grew up with 2 countries and 2 nationalities and 1 language. I couldn't win. So yeah, we can become desensitized to some words, and others still have a lot of power and outrage, right? Words can also change meaning drastically over time. You probably are aware, but there was a time not too long ago, there's still people alive who, to them, gay means happy, and now it means something else. Words can morph and change over time. It's important for us to remember that language has all of these different powers, all of these different aspects to it when we turn it back on something like our industry. So this is the foundation for everything I'm about to talk about. Language is very powerful, and we have to acknowledge that. It's important, not just for communication, but for all sorts of things. Language matters a lot. So what I want you to do this morning is I want us to consider all of the words that we use in our jobs, in our various roles in this industry, whether we're working with ourselves, within our own organization, working with other organizations. Consider where they come from, how their meaning affects what we do, how they're interpreted by us and the people we work with and the clients that we work with and for, how we use them, and ultimately how we may be able to improve our industry vocabulary, which again is going to, let's think of it almost as kind of best practices and the way we might think of documentation, but instead of for code or for design patterns, this is for our own industry, for what we're setting up for the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years. We're the ones who are responsible for that and who will be looked back on as either having had a lot of foresight or having moved too quickly to realize that we were setting things up for many decades to come. So let's look at how we come up with our language in an industry like this. And every industry is the same, right? If you look at patterns of how language that's specific, a lexicon that's specific to an industry develops over time, there's a lot of similarities to what we're going through right now in the early stages of any other industry. There just aren't as many industries around right now that are brand new like us, that move so quickly and that are full of so many smart people that are able to adapt so quickly. We're a very unique position. If you look at anything like engineering, architecture, medicine, any of the sciences, the language changes over time. The more we learn, the more accurate language becomes. And if you look at the early days of any industry, you find that there was no agreement on anything. There was some people over here were calling this technique one thing, and the people over here had a completely different term for it. And eventually, after decades and decades, or sometimes centuries and centuries, people came together and understood. We have the benefit of being connected throughout the entire world already and being able to leapfrog that, I think. So one of the ways that we develop our language is that we borrow from other industries, other people that have already defined something that relates to what we want to use. So I consider these words that are actively used, right? They're in current use somewhere else, not in our industry. Non-archaic words, and we'll talk about archaic terms in a minute, but anything that's archaic is something that might have been in the language actively at one point, but isn't anymore. So non-archaic words, active words, phrases, and concepts. Then when we borrow terminology from closely related industries, so what I call sibling industries, things that, where in the Venn diagram there's a little bit of an overlap between what we do and what they do. It's very appealing to do that, but it can be a little dangerous, because when we do that, we create an opportunity for confusion, because we're borrowing a term or a word or a phrase that already has a concept that's kind of similar but not, and that can be dangerous. One of the biggest examples that I keep coming back to a lot in the web, and it's bugged me since the beginning, and there's been a lot of discussion yesterday already that I heard it come up over and over again, and it's been being talked about for at least a decade, maybe more, about how rooted in the print design approach designers are for the web, right? We design things still in static comps and everything else. You know, it's becoming more of an issue as we're talking about getting away from that. But it's been a problem for a long time, because how many of you were print designers at one point and made a transition? Right? There are still print designers who are struggling to transition out of print into web and interaction design. And I think, especially with the web, one of the biggest problems with that is this word, page. This is a perfect example of a sibling word, the terminology we've borrowed from a sibling industry. It's design related. There's a reason why, actually, the word page was used in the early days of the web. Actually, that's a lie. I researched this, and there isn't a reason. It was arbitrary. This is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. You can look into the history, and I won't go on at length about this because I could. I spent months researching this to try and find out why this word actually got into our industry and caused so much confusion. Because how many of you have had, at some point in your careers, especially if you've been around long enough, dealing with clients and having to explain to them the differences in a page, whatever the mental model they have for a page, and what a web page is? Early on, it could have been things like scrolling, before people understood scrolling. I think everyone understands scrolling now, I hope. We'll talk about that too. But I mean, the reason there's confusion here, it has many meanings even within our industry. Now that we're getting thankfully, so into building things in a responsive way, and for me, responsive design, and I'll talk about that actually because it's a great example, it's what the web should have always been, and technically it was to begin with. Before we were getting into layout and graphics, every page was responsive. It was great. We just got distracted for 10, 15 years, and then thankfully came back to it. But this word causes confusion even today, because this is what our mental model is for a page. Even those of us who have been building things for the web for a long, long time, chances are we're still all old enough in this room to have been introduced to this page before the virtual version. Right? So our mental model is still this. Simple, innocuous word, but if you actually seriously want to learn more about exactly where it came from and why it got itself into the lexicon of the web, I wrote a really annoyingly long and meandering essay on it in the manual in issue 1 of the manual, which will be coming out, I think, maybe digitally soon, maybe not. So the point of it is that ultimately the word wasn't planned. It just ended up in documentation at one point, and people picked up on it. That's one of the dangerous things that can happen when we just throw language around. Is anyone dying because of this? No, but think of the numbers of hours of confusion that just one little arbitrary decision to kind of just use a word. It wasn't used in a definition. You can't find it in the initial dictionary that Tim Berners-Lee kind of put together about the terms around what this World Wide Web thing was going to be. It was just used because it matched his mental model. It looked like a page. That was the word he used. This happens a lot to us. So again, it's not the only term that causes this kind of confusion that we borrow from Sibling Industries. Fold, we still use. Where does that come from? Anyone know? We should know. It's the newspaper industry. The newspaper industry, which makes sense because they're folded. In the newspaper industry, it has a meaning, has a very explicit meaning. It doesn't matter that every newspaper might be a different size, a different dimension. For that newspaper, in that context, there's no way anyone's going to misunderstand what that is. It causes problems in our industry because there is no fold. There is no set point. It's completely arbitrary, completely random, changes not just by device, but by personal preference. It's a useless term, but people continue to use it, and it causes confusion because the mental model for it is something completely different, but close enough that we can't reach instant understanding. And we will never reach understanding with it, but we'll continue to have those conversations. No one will ever actually learn across the board. Bleed is the same kind of thing. Very common print term, doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in the web. And we could keep listing these terms that we've borrowed mostly from the print design world. Then we go to a different type of terminology that actually works really well, what I call distant or unrelated, that we're still borrowing, but we're taking it from a place where there's no risk of confusion. So words, terms, or concepts that are, again, coming from such a different place, it might not be very, very different, but it's different enough that there's no chance of confusion. My favorite at the moment, and has been for the last kind of 2.5 years, is responsive architecture. So if you read Ethan's original ALA article about responsive web design, and also the Book Apart book, you'll know that this is where the term came from. This is an example, too, of very intentional naming. Ethan is a very, very smart guy, Ethan Marcotte, and he's also a language nut. So he did not choose responsive web design lightly at all. He knew that he was smart enough to know this is going to probably change our industry, and it's a term that people are going to be using for a very long time to come, and it had to mean something. And it had to be something where there was no chance of confusion. And there's a reason why I think it's caught on. It's not just because it makes sense to all of us, it's because we all get it, because the naming of it was done so intentionally and so well. So responsive architecture is architecture that responds to the environment around it and the people within it, right? The model for it makes sense, but there is no chance that we or any of our clients are going to confuse something we build for the web with a building, right? It's far enough away, the industry we're borrowing from is far enough away that there's no chance of confusion. It doesn't have to be completely unrelated, it's just like this. So one of my favorite examples is this fantastic building in Paris that has these irises around the entire outside of the structure, and they adapt and change. The aperture changes throughout the day to provide a consistent amount of light to the people inside all day long. Right? Great. If you were having to explain to someone for the very first time what responsive web design is, you could just very easily explain to them responsive architecture and say, this is kind of the idea, is that it's something that interacts well with its environment and for the people that are within it, and all of the benefits that responsive architecture has, and you get that mental model in their heads, and then you go, and now we're just going to do that, but for your website or for your web app. And it works. There are other terms that that also work, maybe not in the exact same way as this, but we have plenty of examples of terms that have taken root in our industry because there's no confusion about them. Ajax was one of them. No risk of confusion. It was the name of a cleaning product. Again, whether it was a good term or not or whatever, we can debate that. It doesn't matter. We were able to say, when you said Ajax, people knew what it meant. There was very little chance of confusion at all because of that. Web, one of the absolute best things that the World Wide Web could have been called, because again, I don't think anyone's going to mistake this network for something spider related, but the model for what it is maps perfectly for what it is, for what this connected network is. We don't think about things like that because it made so much sense the first time we heard it, but there's a reason why it made so much sense. It was picked very, very intentionally. Tim Berners-Lee did not just put a bunch of words on pieces of paper, dump them in a hat, and just randomly pick out and go, okay, we're going to call it the web. God, I hope he didn't. We could have had the worldwide juice. It would have been completely silly, right? So intentionally picking even what seem like the simplest of words maybe now, or even when you select them, when we do this as an industry, has long-reaching effects. So a mature industry of any sort coins its own terms. So we can borrow from others, and that's fine. We have to do that a lot, especially at the pace that we move, and we introduce new concepts that need to be communicated very, very quickly. But it doesn't mean we need to make these things up from scratch. We can take inspiration. Again, this is where responsive web design comes in. The reason that it has made sense to us immediately is that the model it mapped from made complete sense. So this is a term borrowed from architecture, combined with web design. It creates a brand new concept with no chance of confusion, but it's inspired directly by its source. I think this is one of the most powerful ways that we can create language and that's industry specific. The concept maps one-to-one, so that's very, very powerful. We do all know about this, yes, right? Raise your hand if you don't know about responsive web design or you haven't read it yet. Okay, good. Move on. So the final category of terminology that we can and do use, but the sources are archaic words. So I mentioned them earlier. We've got non-archaic words that are kind of dangerous when we borrow them because they're active, they're in use. But archaic words are kind of safe. They're things that are so old that they're not in public or common use anymore, whether they're words, phrases, or concepts. Some of them are used very, very commonly in computing, and you probably don't know about their origins, or we don't think about them. The reason we don't think about it is because we don't have to, right? Which is very powerful. Scroll is one of my favorites. Again, basics. We know that a scroll is something, right? But there's no chance of confusion, right, with the physical ancient artifact of a scroll that, maybe we still use them every once in a while in a symbolic way these days, but we don't use them anymore. When it came into being, when it was selected as a term for computing, it was safe because no chance of confusion, but it also kind of had a great map, mental model-wise. This is definitely not a computer, no chance of confusion, right? But we have to remember that there was a time where that term wasn't used, and this had to be introduced to people, and no one knew how to scroll. And this is one of my favorite little nuggets, is that when the Mac came out, this idea of a window and content that you could see part of but not all of, which makes total sense to us now, and for most of us when we first experienced it, we didn't have to have it explained to us, thankfully. But there was a time where it did, and there's a page that, unfortunately, this is the best resolution image I could find online, and I don't have an original Mac version 1 manual yet. But this is from the first manual for the Macintosh, right? There was a time where scrolling had to be explained as a concept. And this shows to me why it was such a brilliant use of an archaic term. Because, again, very, very intentional. I've heard stories from people who either worked at Apple back in those days or worked with people who, since, who worked at Apple in the technical documentation department. These people were geniuses. They were probably idiot savants on some level because they were having to introduce very, very new concepts to a brand new audience in a way that didn't feel like computing for what people, they were trying to change people's minds. And we forget how big a deal that was. But so very intentional selections like this, you see that, it makes sense, we can move on, suddenly the word scroll is in our language and job done, right? Very, very smart use. And this is what a mature industry does. So this is an example of the computing industry on the whole making mature industry choices. Computing has been around for a very long time compared to our little corner of it, right? They made lots of mistakes along the way, but as an industry matures, it gets to the point where people realize that they need to make very, very careful decisions when introducing new concepts because these things are going to stick around. This could have, scrolling, the act of what we call scrolling, could have been called anything else, and there's a very good chance that if it had been called something else, however benign it might have seemed, moving, maybe it could have been called moving. You're moving a document on the screen. Why not? How much confusion would that have caused when we got into other types of applications where you moved things in different directions? Scrolling is, it can be horizontal, it can be vertical, and sometimes, but that's pretty much scrolling. We call other things panning, and we have different words for other types of movement, and that's very good, no confusion. So as we reach maturity, because I think we're at the point now, because of how fast we move, we're an accelerated industry. We don't have to wait 30 years, 40 years down the road to feel like we've actually sorted ourselves out. We kind of reinvent ourselves every few years. No other industry can do that. We move very rapidly. The danger with moving rapidly is that we don't look far enough ahead. We make decisions because we've got so many things going on. Guys like this dude create Bootstrap, and suddenly we've got to fill our heads with something else, which is really cool. But this is happening every day in our industry, right? We've got amazing new things to shove into our heads, and most of us are actually creating some of those things too. So we're not just intaking; we're generating and generating and generating and generating. That's fantastic. It's great. We can invent anything we want. We have the most power, I think, of any professional industry on the planet, and we need to remember that. But that power it's in all of our hands, and we're setting up what's going to come. A serious discipline, any serious discipline, develops a distinct, clearly defined vocabulary over time. And for us, it's the words and phrases that are going to lead the next generation of our practitioners. The kids that are going to the code club that Dennis was talking about yesterday, these kids are coming in and being taught things that we kind of maybe had to learn and relearn and relearn and relearn. And how amazing is it that so many things have been worked out over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years that they don't have to learn. They can come in and start from scratch with all these amazing things. And yet, we invent so quickly, so rapidly, that they're going to be inventing things. We need to have, I think, a broader approach to how we define our vocabulary, and kind of set it up and plan. How many of you work in an agency environment? Okay. There's a good chance that for some things that you do, I've experienced this with a lot of agencies that I've kind of worked with on projects, that one agency will have their own lexicon. It's mostly the same as what everyone else in the industry will use, but maybe they've branded some process in a particular way. You might have found that some of your agencies do that as well, that someone decides that for your clients, you're going to call it X, so that it's easier to market. I've also seen situations where two agencies are working together on a project and are speaking slightly different languages, not languages proper, but web languages, have slightly different terms for different things. That's more likely to happen with new concepts, but not only. It kind of happens on an ongoing basis. it gets worse when we're dealing with clients or we're trying to teach people. And I've also seen this happen at conferences where I'm sitting in the back of the room, thankfully not good conferences and not this one, but there are some events that I've been in, I'm sitting in the back of the room seeing someone up on stage teaching a concept improperly. Like, not my opinion it's improper, but just, okay, there is a best practice for this and they're just making shit up. And it's not that they're making stuff up to try and look unique or anything else. It's probably just that they might not know, because we don't have any kind of central dictionary yet either. What was it? We've had plenty of examples, like W3 schools of things being taught incorrectly. This is a dangerous thing. We all realize it, but we don't have any governing body. We're not required to to pass any specific exams in order to work in our industry or get accreditation. It's one of the downsides of the flexibility that our industry has, is that other than the W3C looking out for the languages we use to build things, they're not looking out for the language that we use to talk about what we build. And we need to pay attention to that. As we define our language, we just have to remember that all of these decisions that we make, and it's important to remember that we make them. Someone else isn't making these things. Someone in here could be come up with the next groundbreaking thing for the industry. Everyone probably knew Ethan Marcotte before responsive web design, but he hadn't coined anything yet. Now he's changed an entire industry. And no one cared who Mark Otto was. I kid, but I mean, who doesn't know about Bootstrap? Like, it's one person can affect an entire industry. How amazing is that? I wish we had that kind of change in our governments, that kind of power. But that's how powerful we are. We can change the world for the people who build the web in a blog post or in a tweet. It's happened a lot. I remember the tweet where Chris Messina suggested that something like, that a hash symbol could have meaning, could add meaning and context. There was a time where hashtags didn't exist. One guy, this would make this more useful, and now we have hashtags everywhere, and they are, right? But thankfully, for the rest of us, Chris is the kind of person who thinks very carefully before suggesting something like that. It wasn't a flippant suggestion. Ethan didn't just pick responsive web design randomly. He loved responsive architecture. He understood that this combination of things that he was putting together was kind of similar, and that if it didn't have a concept that people could understand and map to right away, it wouldn't catch on. He picked it carefully. It caught on. It's even bigger, I think, now than he might have even imagined. I've had a couple of chats with him, and even a year after his article came out, his head was kind of spinning about how everyone had just kind of switched to doing this. This could be any of you. So just remember, as you go through the rest of your day today, as you're listening to the rest of the sessions today, as you go back into the office on Monday, as you have conversations with your coworkers, with your clients, with your bosses, just be a little more aware and a little bit more intentional about the language that you use, and try and catch everyone else and yourself, if possible, when they try to make something up. Marketing teams are kind of horrible at this. Wanting to call something just for the sake of it, right? That shouldn't be done lightly, is all I'm saying. This isn't, as I said at the beginning, this isn't a list of 10 things you can do to improve your web vocabulary. It's our responsibility, all of us here, to set up the future of our industry. That's a big responsibility for us because of how this industry works. It is built by all of us. It grows because of all of us. And we owe it to 5 years and 10 years and 15 years from now, to the people who will be coming into the industry then, to make sure that we're making really smart decisions. Thanks. Now, Now we have, what, like 7 minutes?
Exactly, so
Cool.
go ahead for questions.
If you have any. I mean, if I hurt your brain, then my apologies. Go get some coffee. Yes, sir. That's not just a German thing. No. No, it's...
Sorry, Dan, can you just put the question again for the live stream?
Yes, no, that's a good point. Yeah, and if you have a question, raise your hands and maybe a microphone will be run to you. So the question is, is the term web design itself, there are people, let's say non-educated clients who might hear that term and think of it as something cheap, or as someone who's going to program something. How many of you have not experienced that? Right, no hands go up. This is a universal thing. It happens, still happens. I was having a conversation last night as well about the differences of perception about what people understand and what they don't, especially with clients and but also bosses and how you go about convincing them of things. That's always going to be a struggle. I'm sure. Actually, I know for a fact that architects have that trouble. Because they're dealing with clients who don't understand how to build and design and engineer buildings, and they have to explain it to them. And there are certain aspects that clients will think are easy. It might be a different scale because people will.
It's different because I mean, as a designer, as an architect, you have this flash and know that. Yeah.
Well, but
and the word design is really not. I mean, design is not a word which is which doesn't have like very strong boundaries.
Exactly, which it's one of the great things and one of the negative things. And this shows how, like, a better question maybe is to try and figure out why web design got that reputation. And I think that it's easy. It's because anyone can do it. And the reason we're all in this room is because anyone can do it. There are no barriers to entry. There are 10-year-olds who are fantastic, front-end developers because they can be. They don't have to wait to be old enough to go to school to get, they just can do it. That's a benefit, and it's also a detriment to us. The only way that we can, there are many ways that we could try and fix something like that. You can call yourself something else. That's the easiest way. Might not be the best way because it could cause other kinds of confusion. I think that's one of the reasons ultimately why the web industry is so obsessed with changing titles and inventing new titles and positions all the time. It's just nuts. It's manic. It's like we're bored and we've got nothing better to do than create new categories within our discipline that we're going to be this now. No, you're still doing the same thing you were doing last week. You're just calling something because we feel this need to identify our experience in a way that feels appropriate to what we're doing and to the quality of what we're doing. I think the reason we do that is because a lot of us feel that same way about web design as a term. It's not just our clients. We kind of have this little thing in the back of our heads that goes, I can call myself a web designer, but that guy over there who sucks is also a web designer, and I don't want to be identified with him. I don't want to identify myself with him. I don't think there's a particular answer. It's just something to be aware of. That's just another example of the power and flexibility of language and how it affects people's perceptions. And it does happen in other industries. It's just on a different scale, right? Doctor, or
not too long, Vitaly.
a lot of different things, and
sorry,
you have to get specific. Oh, Vitaly.
No, I just want to. I have a note because I had an interesting conversation with Russian designers, and so we have kind of different terms for different things in the English-speaking industry. We have responsive design, we have adaptive design. So they have real trouble translating both terms into Russian because essentially they translate both into the same thing. So for them there is no responsive design. It's all, they translate it into adaptive web design. So it's all adaptive web design.
See, now that's So that's
It wasn't a question,
No,
really.
that's a very good point. So this is the kind of thing I mean. We didn't need a term for adaptive web design. I don't care what anyone says. We didn't need the term. It's a variation on a concept. It's a different way of doing. It's a different way of. It's not even that different, really. Let's be honest. Why did we need a new piece of terminology for it? We had one. I've always thought about the arguments that I've heard people getting really heated in person about in past years, pre-responsive web design, about flexible versus fluid, right? It's navel gazing. It's semantics, and ultimately it can be entertaining for the people who get into those conversations, but for the rest of the industry and for the clients that we're trying to talk to, having confusion in our language is bad. And that's a fantastic example of the fact that these terms need to be translated a lot, not just the concepts translated, but the terminology. We need to be very careful about that. I don't know who to blame for the word adaptive getting put in front of web design, but it was someone who probably was the same kind of person who would get into an argument about the semantics of flexible versus fluid. And these things happen a lot, again, because there's no requirement to pass new terms in front of a review board before they get into the language, and someone can tweet something or write a blog post, and that's the fantastic thing about the industry, right? And it's also got a potential to be very destructive, because maybe you are still a little bit confused about some aspects of responsive web design, and someone writes something very, very intelligent about what they think are some differences, and they're going to put a term to it, and it makes sense. And it wouldn't have caught on if it didn't make sense. But having something like that make sense versus the long-range implications of the confusion that it introduces, these are the things that most of us don't think about, and we really need to think about them. Actually, while I'm thinking about it, while I've got Mark, how did you choose Bootstrap as a name? That's what you get for sitting in the front row.
Wow, that's all right. So originally, it wasn't actually called Bootstrap. When it was at Twitter before we open sourced it, it was called the Twitter Blueprint. And the reason we called it Blueprint is because I was working on it with a bunch of engineers, and I'm not an engineer, I'm not a developer. I'm a designer first and foremost, but I don't really subscribe to that kind of title either. I just make stuff on the internet, and if that was a title, I would use that. But they didn't like the idea of calling it a style guide or anything, or documentation really. And so we tried to come up with something that everyone was just like, yeah, we understand what that means and how we can use something like that in whatever we're doing. So if it's a blueprint for how to build things, then all of a sudden they know how to build things, right? They can look at the blueprint and figure out, oh, this is here, and this is how, and these how these things come together. So yeah. It was originally called Blueprint. The problem with that is there was already Blueprint CSS, and I didn't want any ill will when we actually open sourced it. So I knew that we had to change it. And there's this other thing that I've worked on called pre-boot. And so what I did, that originally was called Bootstrap. It was just less mixins and variables. And so I was like, well, this name's okay. Twitter legal department, is this name okay? And they're like, yeah, I guess. And we're like, okay, cool, we'll go with Bootstrap. And so we picked it. And so just that idea of like something of just like kind of getting started from maybe nothing or a small subset of things, then just to get a jumping off point is what that had to embody. So,
which is great. And I've always liked Bootstrap as a term because there's no confusion in our industry, right? That's we use it for different things, right? We talk about bootstrap startups, but there's no confusion. The idea is that, as you said, it's something you're starting from scratch with some sort of. It kind of got a scrappy connotation to it as well. It's not prescribing much. It's just helping you at the start, and that works. I'd venture to say that you're a really smart guy, and you wouldn't have chosen something that might have led to any confusion. Just like the basic example is not choosing, not keeping Blueprint because there was already a blueprint and you didn't want any ill will, but also not ill will. Like the confusion would have been crazy. Yeah. Which blueprint? We don't need that, but that happens. How often have you come across something in the last 5 years where there are 2 or more things that use the same name That's an easy thing to avoid if you're looking out for avoiding it. But we tend not to think about this stuff enough. Yeah, why not?
I was kidding with Vitaly.
One more. One more?
If there is.
Doesn't have to be. I'm one of these people who hates to ask a question in front of lots of people, so I'll be out in all of the breaks if anyone actually wants to talk. Oh, great, yes.
I'm just wondering, do you see us going back to changing the name of fold and bleed, those Spring-inspired terms in web?
So you mean actually changing,
Yeah.
coming up with things? That's a conversation I've been having with people on and off for years. It's really hard to. The problem is that once a word enters a lexicon, and catches on, it's really, really difficult to get rid of it. This is the other thing about language, is that if we throw things around arbitrarily, we might get stuck with something we really don't want, and that doesn't do us any good and does us a disservice. It would have been great if I've been trying to come up with terms to replace fold for ages, and as have a lot of other people. My favorite, I think, at the moment is one Jared Spool uses, and he just calls it the scroll, which, it's so odd that it makes you think about it, and so you realize that it's not a fixed point, but it's not the perfect term, and he doesn't think it's the best term either, but he just knows it's better than fold, because fold implies a point, scroll implies movement. It's not great though. The problem is unless we kind of get a few generations ahead and everyone in the industry stopped using a term, that's what would be required. Everyone would have to say, we are not going to call it a fold anymore. None of us. If our clients say that, we're going to ignore them as if they didn't speak, and we're going to educate as much as possible. And here's the new term that we're all going to use. And then in 10 years, fold would maybe go away. But that's the tough thing about language. Just language in general, not our industry, not industry-specific language. I would love it if people could come up with a better term for these things. But I think what also happens is, and then I'll let you guys go. Because our industry moves so quickly, we have kind of a benefit that as we change the way we work, certain concepts fall away, especially the ones that are weaker. So some of you might say yes to this, but I'm hoping not. How many people still use the term actively DHTML? Right? We don't. Because we don't have to, other than Vitaly. It's a lucky thing you have editors, because they're making you look smart, fixing all your old terminology all the time. So that's one example. We have many examples because our industry moves so quickly, and we have so many new concepts and things we were doing 5 years ago we're not doing anymore, right? That's a benefit if we use it intentionally as a benefit. There are things that once we have a better practice for, I really hate the term, in an industry like ours, we don't have best practices, we have better practices. Because tomorrow there will be a better one. Right, and referring to something as a best practice is as bad as referring to a fold. It's a fixed point. But what was the best practice 5 years ago now might be a horrible way to do something, right? And if someone's picking up an old book and it's best practices for front-end development, it doesn't have an asterisk saying best practices for front-end development in the next 3 months after this book was written. Please burn after reading. It's the same problem with non-dated blog posts. People find them and think that this hack is the solution to their problems, and it just so happens that we actually know 5 years on that it's a horrible thing and it'll break the current browser. This is the stuff we have to deal with. But there are ways for us to grow out of bad terminology if we're paying attention to it. If we let that stuff die. And especially if we come up with new things to replace it. So, yeah, get your thinking caps on because we're all in charge of this stuff. And I actually think that if we all think about these problems, we will make the industry better, not just for us and for our clients. And I mean, the way people perceive us is based a lot on the way that we present ourselves, and the attention to detail that we put into our work. I think we should put into our industry growth and our maturity as well, because we're very good at it. We're great at solving problems. I was speaking with Marcus, one of the organizers, yesterday about this. One of the things, and I know I said I'd let you go, but I will after this. We have to remember the power that we have. We happen to work in a kind of narrow-ish industry, but I firmly believe that the people who work in and around the web are some of the best and most nimble thinkers, the best lateral thinkers that the world probably has right now. We're so great at solving problems. We tend to apply them to a given set of problems that are in the same kind of industry umbrella, but because we can invent anything we need to, we don't think in terms of restrictions. That's a really, really powerful thing when you've got a world full of incredibly smart problem solvers. So all I'm suggesting is that we turn those problem-solving skills on our own industry every once in a while, and not just for the latest, coming up with a new design pattern or a new way of developing things. We can think of the other aspects that improve the way we grow. Go get some coffee and snacks, and talk to me if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Dan. So we have a short break now to change room if you want to.